Smoke, gunfire, the taste of copper filling my mouth as I dragged a 200-pound man across broken glass, praying his heart would keep beating long enough for the sirens to matter. 3 months ago, I didn't know his name. 3 months ago, he was the man my father taught me to hate before I could walk. Now I was the only thing standing between Damien Cross and a bullet meant for his skull, and I would have taken it myself before I let him die. This is how a war started. This is how I fell for the enemy. 3 months earlier, my life still belonged to my father. That's the only way I know how to explain what happened next. Every choice I made before that night was already decided for me. Who I greeted at the door, who I smiled at over dinner, who I would eventually be handed to like a signature on a contract. My name is Vivian Calloway, and until the night the Belhaven room exploded into chaos, I thought I understood exactly what kind of world I lived in. I was wrong. The Belhaven was my father's favorite place to conduct business dressed as pleasure. A private supper club 3 floors above a jazz bar, velvet booths, low light, men in $3,000 suits pretending the guns under their jackets were just part of the tailoring. My father, Marcus Calloway, had built an empire out of patience and fear in equal measure. And that night he was hosting a dinner meant to seal an alliance with a shipping magnate named Elias Ford. I was there because a Calloway daughter at the table made men trust the family more. I'd learned to smile through worse. I didn't know the dinner was a trap until the lights went out. 3 minutes. That's how long it took for 6 armed men in ski masks to turn the Belhaven room into a slaughterhouse. I remember Elias Ford's champagne glass shattering before he did. I remember my father's bodyguard, a barrel-chested man named Otis, who'd worked for us since I was a child, throwing himself over me a half-second before the first spray of bullets tore through the booth where we'd been sitting. Otis didn't get up again. I don't remember deciding to run. I remember my hands, slick with someone else's blood, finding the service door behind the kitchen. I remember the fire escape, 3 flights down into an alley that smelled like rain and old grease. My silk dress tearing on a rusted railing, my breath coming in short, useless gasps that didn't feel like enough air to keep a person alive. I remember falling the last 4 feet and not getting back up. The alley swallowed the sound of the gunfire behind me, replaced it with something worse, silence, and the slow, cold understanding that I was alone, bleeding from a graze along my shoulder I hadn't even felt happen, and that whoever had opened fire on that dinner had wanted my father's whole table dead, myself included. I don't know how long I lay there, long enough for the rain to soak through what was left of my dress, long enough for my thoughts to blur into something thick and slow, like walking through water. I remember thinking, absurdly, that I hoped I hadn't ruined the shoes. My mother had given them to me. Then I remember thinking nothing at all. A voice pulled me back. She's still breathing, low, controlled, not a voice that belonged to panic. I forced my eyes open to a version of the world tilted sideways. Wet pavement, a dumpster, and above me a man crouching low enough that his coat brushed the filthy ground without him seeming to notice or care. Dark hair damp from the rain, a jaw set hard enough to look carved rather than grown, and eyes the color of a storm that hadn't decided yet whether to break. "Who are you?" he said. Not really a question, more a demand dressed as one. "I don't," I managed, and then the words dissolved into a cough that tasted like blood. He didn't flinch. Didn't recoil the way I might have expected from a stranger finding a half-dead woman behind a nightclub. Instead, he reached out, 2 fingers pressing gently to the side of my throat, checking a pulse like he'd done it 100 times before and would do it 100 times again without losing sleep over any of them. "Someone shot up the Belhaven 20 minutes ago," he said, mostly to the man standing behind him, a broad-shouldered shadow with a shaved head and a scar through one eyebrow. "She came out the fire escape." "Boss, we should move," the shadow said. "Whoever hit that dinner might still be circling." "Boss." The word cut through the fog in my head, just enough to register, to file itself somewhere important, even if I couldn't place why yet. The man in front of me, boss apparently, he studied my face with an attention that felt like being measured for something. Not kindness exactly, not cruelty either. Calculation, the way you'd study a hand of cards you hadn't decided whether to fold. "What's your name?" he said quietly. I almost lied. Some instinct, some inherited Calloway reflex, told me that names were currency, and you didn't hand over currency to strangers in alleys, no matter how badly you needed help. But the rain was cold, and my ribs ached where I'd hit the fire escape railing, and lying felt like more effort than I had left in me. "Vivian," I whispered, and then because some part of me needed him to understand the danger he might be stepping into, "Vivian Calloway." Something shifted behind those storm-colored eyes. Not a shock. Recognition sharpened into something colder. "Calloway," he repeated. Low, almost to himself, he glanced once at the man behind him, some silent exchange passing between them that I was too battered to decode. Then his gaze came back to me, and whatever softness had been there a moment before had hardened into something unreadable. "Do you know who I am?" he said. "No," I admitted. A humorless smile, there and gone. "Good," he said. "Keep it that way for now." He lifted me like I weighed nothing, one arm beneath my knees, the other bracing my back, careful of the shoulder wound without me having to ask. I should have been afraid. I told myself I was afraid, but mostly I was aware of the warmth of him against the cold rain and the strange, dangerous relief of being carried by someone who moved like nothing in the world could touch either of us as long as he didn't allow it. "Where are you taking me?" I managed. "Somewhere safer than a fire escape," he said, and then quieter, almost like he hadn't meant to say it out loud. "Somewhere I can figure out what the hell just happened to my city tonight." The rain kept falling, my eyes kept closing. The last thing I heard before the dark took me under was his voice, flat and certain, speaking to the man beside him. "Get Dr. Ansel, and find out everything there is to know about Marcus Calloway's daughter." I didn't know yet that the man carrying me through the rain was Damian Cross, the one name my father had taught me, since childhood, to fear above every other name in the city. I didn't know that 6 months earlier, my father had ordered the death of Damian's older brother, a quiet, unassuming man named Elliot Cross, who'd wanted nothing to do with the family business, and died for a war he never chose to fight in. I didn't know that the two families had been circling each other for a decade, waiting for an excuse to finish what old grudges had started. All I knew, when I woke hours later in a bed that wasn't mine, in a house that smelled like cedar and gun oil and something achingly clean, was that the man who'd carried me out of that alley hadn't let go of me once. And somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the confusion, beneath every warning I'd absorbed since I was old enough to understand what my last name meant to people like him, a small and reckless part of me was glad he hadn't. The room I woke in had high ceilings and tall windows dressed in charcoal curtains, heavy enough to swallow the streetlight outside completely. A lamp glowed low in the corner. My shoulder had been cleaned and stitched, my ribs wrapped tight enough that breathing came with a dull, insistent ache. I lay there for a long moment, cataloging the unfamiliar shapes of the room, before I noticed the man sitting in the chair across from the bed, elbows on his knees, watching me with the patient stillness of someone who'd been doing exactly that for hours. "You're awake," he said. "You didn't leave," I said, my voice a rasp. "No," he agreed, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I don't leave loose ends unattended, especially not ones with your last name." The word landed like a slap, reminding me all at once of everything I'd let myself forget in the rain. "Calloway," I said quietly. "You know my father." "I know your father very well," he said, and something in his tone went flat and cold enough that the temperature of the whole room seemed to drop. "Better than you'd like, I imagine." I pushed myself up against the pillows, wincing. "Then you know I shouldn't be here." "You're right," he said. "You shouldn't be." He leaned forward, forearms braced on his knees, gray eyes steady on mine. "And yet here you are, bleeding in my house, carried out of an ambush at a dinner your father was hosting. Which raises a question I intend to answer before the sun comes up, Ms. Calloway." "What question?" I whispered. He studied me a long moment before he answered, like he was deciding how much of the truth I could carry. "Whether someone tried to kill your father tonight," he said slowly, "or whether someone wanted me to find you in that alley." His name, I learned before that first night was over, was Damian Cross, and the empire he ran from behind blacked-out windows and quiet, unmarked buildings was the same one my father had spent a decade warning me to never go near, never speak to, never so much as glance at, if I passed one of his men on the street. I hadn't understood why, growing up. I understood a little better now, sitting in his house with stitches in my shoulder, listening to him explain, in a voice with no warmth in it at all, that his older brother Elliot had died on my father's orders. 6 months earlier, over a shipment, my father believed Elliot had stolen. Elliot hadn't stolen anything. He'd simply been standing in the wrong warehouse on the wrong night, an accountant with no interest in the family business, caught in the machinery of men who didn't believe in innocent bystanders. He wasn't like me, Damien said, staring past me at the window. He wanted out. Your father made sure he never got the chance. I didn't have an answer for that. What answer was there? I'd grown up believing my father was ruthless, but necessarily so, a man protecting what was his in a world that rewarded only the strong. I'd never once considered that the things he protected might be built on graves he didn't think twice about digging. I didn't know, I said quietly. I believe you, Damien said, which surprised me more than anything else he'd said that night. Which is the only reason you're still breathing in my house instead of on your way back to your father with a message tied to your ribs. A woman named Sophia Lang tended to me over the following days, sharp-eyed, economical with her words, fiercely loyal to Damien in a way that made it clear she'd earned her place at his side through more than convenience. She changed my dressings, brought me food I didn't have the appetite for, and answered my questions with a caution that told me exactly how carefully she was choosing what to reveal. Why hasn't he sent me back? I asked her on the third day, watching rain streak down the window of the guest room that had somehow, without my noticing exactly when, become my room. Sophia considered the question longer than it should have taken. Because whoever hit the Bellhaven didn't just try to kill your father, she said finally. They tried to make it look like Damien did it. The words landed like ice water. What? The shooters left a calling card, Sophia said, a symbol Damien's organization used years ago, before he took over from his father. Whoever planned that attack wanted your father to believe Damien ordered the hit. They wanted a war between your families, and they wanted it to start that night. Who would do that? Sophia's expression tightened. That's what Damien's trying to find out, and it's the only reason you're still here, instead of dead in that alley or sent home in pieces. Because right now, you're the one person who can prove Damien didn't do it. I hadn't expected that. I'd expected to be a hostage, a bargaining chip. Leverage in whatever war my father's world seemed permanently poised to erupt into. Instead, I was evidence, protection, a living contradiction to whatever lie someone had constructed to burn two families to the ground. It should have felt better than being a hostage. Somehow it didn't feel better at all. Damien came to see me himself that evening, dismissing Sophia with a glance before pulling the chair beside my bed the way he had that first night. He'd changed out of the dark coat into a simple charcoal shirt, sleeves rolled to his forearms, and for the first time since the alley, he looked less like the man my father had warned me about and more like someone capable of exhaustion. You look tired, I said, before I could stop myself. I don't sleep well when there's a war brewing that I didn't start, he said, not quite a joke, not quite serious. How's the shoulder? Sore. Sophia told me about the calling card. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Then you understand the position we're both in. I understand that someone wants my father and you at each other's throats, I said. What I don't understand is why. Damien was quiet for a moment, turning something over behind those storm gray eyes. There's a man named Victor Kessler, he said eventually, runs an operation on the East Docks that's been trying to muscle into this city for 3 years. Your father's shipping routes and my distribution network are the only two things standing between Kessler and a monopoly on everything that moves through this port. And if we go to war with each other, we weaken each other enough that Kessler walks in and takes what's left, Damien finished. It's not subtle, it's not even particularly clever, it's just patient, and it very nearly worked 3 nights ago. I sat with that for a long moment, the pieces settling into a shape uglier than anything I'd imagined. My father doesn't know any of this. No, Damien agreed. Your father believes I tried to kill him at his own dinner table, which means right now, the only reason this city isn't already burning is that you're alive and you're here. And eventually, one way or another, you're going to have to convince him of the truth. The weight of that settled over me like the rain outside the window. He won't believe me, I said quietly. Not if it comes from your house. He'll think you turned me, or threatened me, or worse. Probably, Damien admitted. Which is why we're not doing it that way. Then how? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and for the first time since the alley, I saw something in his expression that wasn't calculation. It looked almost like reluctant respect. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I know I'm not sending you back into a house that might get you killed before you get the chance to speak. You're keeping me here to protect me," I said slowly, "not just because I'm useful." Something flickered across his face, gone before I could name it. "Does it matter which?" he said, "as long as you're safe?" It shouldn't have. And yet it did, more than I wanted to admit. Over the following 2 weeks, something began to shift between us that I didn't have a name for yet. Damien ran his organization with a discipline that bordered on austere. I watched him field calls at all hours, negotiate with suppliers, calm nervous allies who'd heard rumors of the Belhaven attack and wanted reassurance that the Cross organization wasn't about to collapse into open war. I watched him do all of it, without once raising his voice, without once allowing the fear rippling through his territory to show on his face. And in the quiet hours between, he would find reasons to check on me. A cup of tea he claimed Sophia had made too much of. A question about how I'd grown up, careful and probing, like he was trying to understand the woman behind the name he'd been taught to distrust as thoroughly as I'd been taught to distrust his. "Your father never let you near the business," he observed one evening, watching me from the doorway of the library where I'd taken to reading through his surprisingly extensive collection during the long, restless afternoons. "He said it wasn't a place for me," I said. "Said I was better used elsewhere." "Elsewhere meaning married to whoever secured the best alliance," I said, more bitterly than I intended. "I was supposed to have dinner with Elias Ford's son next month. Another arrangement dressed up as romance." Damien's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness did. "And what did you want?" No one had asked me that in longer than I could remember. Not my father, who saw a Callaway daughter as an asset to be deployed. Not the string of men who'd courted me over the years with my father's approval, stamped invisibly across every gesture. I opened my mouth to give some deflecting, non-answer, and found to my own surprise that I didn't want to. "I don't know," I admitted. "No one's ever asked before." "That's a shame," Damien said quietly. "You strike me as someone with opinions worth hearing." I felt heat climb up my neck. That had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. "Careful," I said, echoing something Sophia had warned me half-jokingly on my second day here. "People will start to think the Mafia king has gone soft." A slow, dangerous smile touched the corner of his mouth, the first real one I'd seen from him. "I've never been called soft in my life, Miss Callaway," he said. "I'd advise against being the first." "Vivian," I corrected, before I could think better of it. "If we're going to keep having these conversations, you might as well use my name." Something shifted in his eyes, quiet and deliberate, like a door easing open that had been locked for a long time. "Vivienne," he repeated, testing the shape of it. "Careful. Names have a way of meaning more than people intend." I should have taken it as a warning. Instead, lying awake that night in a house that belonged to my father's oldest enemy, I found myself hoping he'd say it again. The peace didn't last. 3 weeks after the Belhaven, Sophia woke me before dawn with news that turned my stomach to ice. My brother Julian had led a strike against one of Damien's warehouses on the south side, convinced, wrongly, furiously, that Damien had been holding me hostage the entire time. 2 of Damien's men were in the hospital. One of Julian's wasn't going to make it. And somewhere in the chaos that followed, I understood with a clarity that frightened me more than any gunfire ever could. The war Victor Kessler wanted had already begun, whether any of us were ready for it or not. Damien took the news standing at the window of his study, back straight, hands clasped behind him in a stillness that frightened me more than shouting would have. Nico Reyes, his second, delivered the report in short, clipped sentences. The warehouse on Delancey Street, 4 of Julian's men, 2 of Damien's wounded, 1 of Julian's crew, a 19-year-old named Petey Marsh, not expected to survive the night. "He came in believing you were holding her," Nico said, glancing at me once, before returning his attention to Damien. "Somebody fed him that story hard enough that he didn't wait for confirmation." "Kessler," Damien said. "It wasn't a question." "Has to be," Nico agreed. "Nobody else benefits from your brother going in guns first, boss. Not your father, not the Callaways, only Kessler. I sat frozen in the chair by the fireplace, hands pressed flat against my knees to keep them from shaking. Julian, my brother, 3 years older than me, has been hot-tempered since childhood. The kind of man who'd always acted first and reasoned later, if he reasoned at all. Of course he'd believed I was a hostage. Of course he hadn't waited to hear otherwise. In our world, waiting got people killed. I have to go to my father, I said. Damien turned from the window, and for a moment the calculation in his eyes gave way to something rawer. Vivian, if you walk into your father's house right now in the middle of this, he won't hear a word you say. He'll see a woman who spent 3 weeks under my roof and assume the worst. Then I'll make him listen, I said, standing despite the way my ribs still ached with the effort. Julian just put a man in a body bag over a lie. If I don't go now and tell my father the truth, this doesn't stop at one warehouse. It becomes something neither of us can undo. Damien studied me for a long moment, some private battle playing out behind his expression. Finally, he nodded. Once, sharp. Then I'm coming with you. That's the last thing that will help. I'm not asking you to bring me into the house, he said. I'm not letting you walk into a war zone alone, Vivian. Those are not negotiable, and you don't get to argue me out of both. I didn't have the strength left to argue at all. We drove to the Callaway estate in silence, Nico at the wheel, Sophia in the back seat beside me, Damien in the front passenger seat with his jaw set hard enough to crack. The gates that had shaped the entire architecture of my childhood rose out of the dark, like something from another life, and for the first time in 3 weeks, I felt the full weight of exactly how far I drifted from the world I'd been raised inside. My father met me in the foyer, flanked by 2 men I recognized, his face carved from the same granite stillness I'd inherited without wanting to. Julian stood behind him, knuckles split, a bruise blooming along one cheekbone, eyes red-rimmed with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with sleep. Vivian. My father's voice cracked, just slightly, before hardening back into control. You're alive. No thanks to whoever opened fire on the Bellhaven, I said. Father, I need you to listen to me, and I need you to listen carefully, because a boy is dying tonight, because Julian believed a lie. A lie, Julian snapped, stepping forward. He had you for 3 weeks, Viv. 3 weeks, and you're defending him? He saved my life, I said, loud enough to still the room. Damien Cross pulled me out of that alley, bleeding and unconscious, and instead of using me as leverage against you, he protected me while we figured out who actually wanted this family destroyed, and it wasn't him. My father's eyes flicked past me to where Damien stood in the doorway, deliberately not crossing the threshold, hands visibly empty at his sides. You brought him into my house. I brought him to the edge of your house, I corrected, because I was not going to let you make the same mistake Julian made. Someone planted a symbol at the Bellhaven meant to make you believe Damien ordered that hit. It's the same reason Julian was fed a story convincing enough to send him into a warehouse with guns blazing. Someone wants us at war with each other, Father, and it's working exactly the way they planned. Silence stretched through the foyer, broken only by the low, unsteady sound of Julian's breathing. Who? My father said finally, low and dangerous. Victor Kessler, Damien said from the doorway, the first words he'd spoken since we arrived. My father's eyes cut to him, sharp with a decade of inherited hatred that didn't dissolve just because the story had changed. He's been circling this city for 3 years, Callaway. Your shipping lanes and my distribution are the last 2 things standing between him and a monopoly on everything moving through this port. He doesn't need to beat either of us in a fight. He just needs us to bleed each other dry. My father was quiet for a long moment, some old, immovable calculation working behind his eyes. And why, he said slowly, should I believe a word out of the mouth of the man who murdered my daughter's peace of mind for 3 weeks? Because I didn't have to bring her back at all, Damien said, voice level, unflinching. I could have kept her as leverage. I could have used her to end this war on my terms months ago. Instead, I'm standing in your foyer, unarmed, because your daughter insisted on telling you the truth before your son gets more of his own men killed over a lie neither of us started. I watched my father's face for any sign of the reaction I needed, some crack in the granite that would tell me he believed us. What I saw instead was worse, a slow, cold understanding settling over his features, the particular stillness of a man recalculating an entire war he thought he understood. Petey Marsh, my father said quietly to Julian. Is he going to live? Julian's jaw worked silently before he managed, the doctors don't know. Then you will sit with his family tonight, my father said, and you will explain to them exactly how their son ended up bleeding out in a warehouse over information you didn't verify. His eyes came back to me, then to Damien, weighing something I couldn't name. And you, he said to Damien, will leave my property before I change my mind about believing my own daughter over 10 years of instinct telling me your family deserves to burn. It wasn't peace. It wasn't even close to peace. But it was, for the first time since the Belhaven, a pause. A fragile, dangerous pause in a war that had very nearly started over nothing but a lie, carefully planted by a man neither family had thought to suspect, until it was almost too late. Damien left the way we'd come, and I stayed behind to sit with my father in his study long after Julian had gone, silent to keep his promise at Petey Marsh's bedside. You care for him, my father said eventually, not looking at me, studying the fire instead. I didn't insult either of us by pretending not to understand. I don't know what I feel, I said honestly. I know he protected me when he had every reason not to. I know he spent 3 weeks trying to stop a war neither of us wanted, while Kessler worked in the shadows to start one anyway. My father was quiet for a long time. Your grandfather used to say, he said finally, that the most dangerous man in any room is the one who has nothing left to lose. He looked at me then, something unreadable in his expression. Damien Cross has spent 10 years believing this family took everything from him that mattered. If Kessler succeeds in making him believe it again, he won't, I said, with more certainty than I fully understood the source of. Not if I have anything to do with it. My father studied me for a long moment, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like respect. Then God help us both, he said quietly, because I think you might actually mean that. I left the estate that night, believing the worst was behind us, that with the truth exposed, Kessler's plan had failed, and whatever fragile peace existed between my father and Damien might hold long enough to unravel the real threat, still circling both our families. I was wrong. Kessler had already moved to his next move before I'd even made it back to Damien's house, and by the time we learned what he'd done, it was almost too late to stop it. We had less than a day of peace. Nico met us at the door when we returned, his expression enough to tell me something had gone badly wrong before he said a word. Boss, he said, Kessler's people hit one of our supply runs on the interstate an hour ago. Took the driver, took the cargo, and left this. He held out a phone, screen lit with a photograph that made my stomach drop through the floor. Julian, bound and bloodied, kneeling on concrete somewhere that looked like the inside of a warehouse, a man's shadow falling across him just out of frame. They didn't just hit a supply run, Damien said, voice gone flat and dangerous in a way I hadn't heard from him before. They took your brother. How? I breathed. He was with my father's men. He was supposed to be. He left the estate an hour after we did, Nico said grimly. Word is he wanted to check on the wounded men from the warehouse. Kessler's people were watching. They didn't need much of a window. I read the message that had come with the photograph twice before the words fully landed. Kessler wanted a meeting. Damien, alone, at the old grain terminal on the East Docks, by midnight. Julian's life as the price of admission. And beneath that, a line clearly meant for me specifically, because whoever had sent it knew exactly how deeply the Calloway and Cross houses were now entangled. Bring the girl, or the boy dies slow. He wants you and me both, I said. This was never about ending a war between our families. He wants to eliminate us both at once. Then he's not getting either of us, Damien said. I'm going alone. No, I said, sharper than I intended. Damien, if you walk in there without me, Kessler kills Julian the second he realizes I'm not coming, and then he kills you anyway, because you'll have nothing left to bargain with. And if you walk in there, Damien said, turning to face me fully, something raw breaking through his usual composure, he uses you exactly the way he intended from the start, Vivian, as a weapon against both our families. I am not handing him that. You don't get to make that decision alone, I said. Not this time. The argument that followed lasted longer than either of us had time for. Sophia and Nico watching in intense silence as we circled the same impossible math from every angle we could find. In the end, it was Nico who broke the stalemate, laying out a plan with the flat, practiced calm of a man who'd spent years thinking 3 moves ahead of exactly this kind of disaster. We go in with a perimeter, he said. Snipers on the rooftops flanking the terminal, 2 teams positioned at both exits. Boss walks invisible, alone, like Kessler wants. Vivian stays back with the second team until we have eyes on Julian's exact position. The second he's secured, we move. And if Kessler doesn't wait that long, Damien said, then we improvise, Nico said grimly. Same as we always do. The old grain terminal rose out of the dark like the skeleton of something long dead. Rusted conveyor towers, stark against a sky bruised purple with the promise of rain. I sat in the second SUV with Sophia beside me, watching through the window as Damien crossed the open lot alone, hands visible, coat open, walking towards a cluster of armed men gathered beneath a broken security light, with the deliberate, unhurried calm of a man who refused to give his enemy the satisfaction of seeing fear. Julian knelt at the center of the group, bound, bruised, alive. Relief and terror tangled together in my chest so tightly I could barely breathe. Victor Kessler stepped forward to meet Damien, and even from a distance I could see the particular, practiced cruelty in the way he moved. A man who enjoyed exactly this kind of moment, the theater of power laid bare in front of an audience. Romano would have brought her, I heard Kessler say. Through the radio Nico had clipped to my collar, his voice carrying easily across the open lot. I was told the crossboy fell hard for the Calloway girl. Disappointing to see you came alone. You wanted a meeting, Damien said, voice carrying the same flat calm I'd come to recognize as the sound of him containing something far more dangerous. I'm here. Let the boy go. After you've handed over the girl, Kessler said. That was the arrangement. There was no arrangement, Damien said. There was a demand, and you're not getting either of us handed over like cargo. Kessler's smile, even at this distance, looked like something worn for effect rather than felt. Then I suppose young Julian here doesn't leave this warehouse tonight. That was the moment I stopped listening to Nico's careful plan. I don't remember deciding to move. I remember Sophia's hand closing on my arm, her voice sharp in my ear. Vivian, don't. We have a plan. And I remember shaking free of it anyway, because some fracturing, desperate part of me understood that if I waited for the perfect signal, my brother might not survive long enough for it to come. I stepped out of the shadows into the broken light of the terminal, and every gun in that lot turned toward me at once. Vivian, no! Damien's voice cracked across the open ground, the first real break in his composure I'd heard since the alley 3 months ago. I'm here, I called out, forcing my voice steady despite the way my whole body was shaking. You wanted me, Kessler. Here I am. Let Julian go. Kessler's gaze swept over me with cold, assessing amusement. Well, he said, how very poetic. The Calloway daughter, walking into the fire for the crosshair. He nodded to one of his men, who wrenched Julian to his feet by the collar. Bring her here. Vivian, don't move, Damien said, low and furious, though I could hear the helplessness bleeding through the command. This isn't the trade. This is exactly what he wants. I know, I said quietly, not taking my eyes off Kessler. But I'm not letting my brother die for a war he didn't start. And I am not letting you die for a war Kessler manufactured out of nothing. So we're doing this my way. Kessler's men closed the distance and gripped my arm, dragging me forward until I stood close enough to see the details of Julian's battered face, the particular hollow terror in his eyes that told me he understood, better than anyone, exactly how close to the edge we all now stood. Viv, Julian rasped, you shouldn't have come. Neither should you have, I said, my voice breaking despite everything. But here we both are. Kessler circled us slowly, hands clasped behind his back, savoring the moment with the unhurried cruelty of a man who'd waited a long time to see 2 powerful families brought low at once. Here's what happens now, he announced, loud enough for Damien to hear across the lot. The girl stays with me. The boy walks free. And Cross here gets to live with the knowledge that everything he built, everything he protected, walked willingly into my hands the moment I asked. No, Damien said, stepping forward despite the guns leveled at him. That was never the deal. There is no deal, Kessler said, smile sharpening. There's only what I decide to allow. He raised a hand, and for one suspended, silent moment, I understood with absolute clarity that Victor Kessler intended for none of us to leave that terminal alive. Not Julian, Not Damien, not me. The trade had never been real. It had only ever been bait. The gunshot that broke the silence didn't come from Kessler's men. Chaos exploded across the terminal in the same instant. Nico's team moving from the flanking positions, Damien surging forward the moment the first shot rang out, Julian dropping to the ground on instinct as the man holding him staggered back, hit. I felt myself yanked sideways, Kessler's grip like iron on my arm, using me exactly the shield he'd always intended me to be. "Let her go," Damien roared, closing the distance in a stride that covered ground faster than should have been possible. And for one terrible, suspended second, I watched Kessler raise a gun toward him instead of toward me, some final desperate act of a man who understood he'd already lost and wanted to take something with him on the way down. I don't remember deciding to move again. I remember throwing myself between them anyway, the way you throw yourself in front of anything you cannot survive losing. And I remember the terrible, deafening crack of the gunshot that followed and Damien's arms catching me before I even understood I was falling. "No," he was saying over and over, lowering us both to the wet concrete, his hands pressed hard against the wound blooming dark across my side. "No, no, stay with me, Vivienne, stay with me." The world narrowed to the sound of his voice and the warmth of my own blood soaking through my clothes. And somewhere beyond that, the sharp, final crack of Nico's rifle, finding Victor Kessler before he could fire again. "I'm here," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely certain the words made it out of my mouth at all. "I'm not leaving, I promise." The last thing I remember before the dark took me under was Damien's voice, raw and breaking in a way I had never once heard from the man my father had spent a decade teaching me to fear, begging whatever God might be listening not to take me from him now, not after everything, not when he'd only just learned what it meant to want something he couldn't order or command or protect through sheer force of will alone. I woke to the sound of a heart monitor and the particular sterile quiet of a private medical wing. Sunlight cutting thin lines through blinds someone had only half closed. My side ached with a deep, insistent pressure that told me before I even looked that I had survived something I probably shouldn't have. Damien was asleep in the chair beside the bed, still in the same clothes from the terminal, a streak of dried blood along his collar that I was fairly certain wasn't his. He looked, for the first time since I'd known him, entirely undefended, the careful control stripped away by exhaustion, replaced by something younger and rawer that made my chest ache worse than the wound in my side. "You're still here," I whispered, my voice cracking with disuse. His eyes snapped open instantly, like he'd been listening for exactly that sound, even in sleep. "Vivian." My name came out of him, like something he'd been holding his breath to say. He was at my side before I'd finished blinking, one hand finding mine with a grip that trembled, just slightly, despite every instinct in him clearly fighting to appear steady. "How long?" I managed. 2 days, he said. The bullet missed everything it needed to miss by less than an inch. Dr. Ansel said, "You're either the luckiest woman he's ever treated or the most stubborn." A ghost of a smile crossed his face, gone almost before it arrived. "I'm inclined to believe both." "Julian," I said, the memory of the terminal flooding back all at once. "Is he?" "Alive," Damien said. "Bruised. Furious with himself. Currently under your father's roof being lectured within an inch of his life. He's fine, Vivian, because of you." "And Kessler?" Something colder passed behind his eyes. "Dead," he said simply. "Nico made sure of it before he could fire a second shot. Whatever war he was hoping to manufacture between our families died with him." Relief loosened something in my chest that had been wound tight since the alley 3 months ago. "Then it's over." "Not entirely," Damien said, and something in his tone made me look at him more carefully. "Your father came here yesterday, while you were still unconscious." I stared at him. "My father came to your house." "He did," Damien said. "Sat in that chair for the better part of an hour, actually, watching you breathe, before he said a single word to me." "What did he say?" Damien was quiet for a moment, choosing his words the way I'd learned he always did when something mattered enough to get exactly right. "He said that in 30 years of running this family, he'd never once seen anyone throw themselves between a bullet and an enemy, the way you did that night. He said his daughter had more courage than every man who'd ever worked for him combined." A pause. "And then he said that if I intended to keep protecting what was his, I'd better be prepared to do it properly, and not from behind the walls of a rival house. My breath caught. He said that. He did, Damien said. I believe the exact phrasing was something closer to, if you're going to love my daughter, Cross, you're going to do it, where I can see you, not in the shadows like something to be ashamed of. A laugh escaped me despite the ache in my ribs, startled and disbelieving. That sounds exactly like him. It did strike me as fairly on brand, Damien agreed, and for the first time since I'd woken, something in his expression eased into real, unguarded warmth. Over the following weeks, while my side healed under Sophia's relentless, no-nonsense care, the fragile ceasefire between my father and Damien slowly hardened into something sturdier than either of them likely expected. I spent long afternoons shuttling between both houses, watching two men who'd spent a decade treating each other as inevitable enemies learn, slowly and without much grace, how to sit in the same room without reaching for old grievances. It wasn't peace exactly. My father remained my father, sharp-edged, suspicious, unwilling to fully release a decade of inherited distrust overnight. But he stopped referring to Damien by his last name alone, stopped speaking of the Cross organization like an enemy camp to be dismantled, and Julian, humbled by the cost of his own recklessness, spent an unexpected number of afternoons at Damien's warehouses, learning grudgingly at first, and then, with something like genuine respect, exactly how disciplined an operation Damien ran compared to the chaos he'd been taught to expect. The night I was finally strong enough to walk the grounds of Damien's estate, without Sophia hovering at my elbow, I found him on the same balcony where, weeks earlier, he'd first told me he wanted something with me he'd never expected to have. "You're supposed to be resting," he said, not turning from the view of the city lights spread out below us. "I've done enough resting to last a lifetime," I said, coming to stand beside him at the railing. "What are you thinking about?" He was quiet for a long moment. "That 3 months ago, I would have told you the most dangerous thing in this city was Victor Kessler," he said finally. "Or your father, or the 10 years of history sitting between our two families like a loaded gun." He turned to look at me then, something unguarded and entirely honest in his expression. "I would have been wrong. The most dangerous thing that happened to me this year was you, walking into that terminal for people who weren't even yours to save. They were mine," I said quietly. "My brother. And you." Something shifted in his eyes at that, quiet and deliberate. "I never asked you to choose me over your own family, Vivian." "You didn't have to ask," I said. "I chose anyway. I'm choosing now." He reached for my hand then, threading his fingers through mine with a careful tenderness that still, even now, caught me by surprise every time. "Your father asked me something before he left the other day," he said. "Whether I intended to marry you or simply keep endangering you indefinitely." I laughed despite myself. "And what did you tell him?" "That I intended to ask you properly," Damien said, "once you were strong enough to say no if you wanted to." He turned to face me fully, something vulnerable and unguarded settling over his features in a way I suspected very few people in his life had ever been permitted to witness. "So I'm asking. Not because our families need the alliance, though I imagine your father would appreciate the symbolism. Not because Kessler nearly destroyed both our worlds trying to keep us apart. Only because I have spent 3 months learning what it means to want something I cannot order, or threaten, or simply take by force. I want you to stay, Vivian. Not because you're bound to this house or to me, but because you choose it, the way you chose to walk into that terminal for people you loved." I looked at the man who had once been nothing more than a name my father taught me to fear, and found, standing there in the cold night air with the whole city glittering below us, that I couldn't imagine choosing anyone else. "Yes," I said simply, "I choose you." He kissed me then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that felt less like the end of a war, and more like the quiet, hard-won beginning of everything that came after it. When he finally drew back, forehead resting against mine, he spoke the words that would carry us both into whatever came next. "Two families," he murmured, "who spent a decade convinced the other was the enemy. And in the end, the only thing either side ever really needed to survive was the daughter neither of us was supposed to fall for." Below us, the city carried on, unaware of the war that had nearly consumed it, unaware of the fragile, hard-won peace, now holding two powerful families together, where a decade of hatred once stood. And for the first time in my life, standing beside a man my father once called an enemy, I understood exactly what it meant to choose my own future instead of simply surviving the one handed to me. I wasn't my father's daughter anymore, not only. I wasn't the enemy's prize, or a war's collateral, or a name to be traded for alliance. I was the woman who walked into the fire for the people she loved, and walked out on the other side with everything that mattered still standing beside her. And that, more than any name, was the legacy I intended to keep.